I'd like to introduce to you our two panelists today. First, Matthew Loveland. And of course, you've got his bio in the program as well. He is an associate professor of sociology and political science at Le Moyne College. He writes about religious identity, religious mobility, and political participation. Recent publications have explored friendships between believers and atheists, as well as religious skepticism and social trust. He earned his PhD in sociology from the University of Notre Dame. Also, I'd like to introduce you to April Manalong. She says you can only call her April Faye if you're angry at her. Otherwise, she says, please call me April. So she is assistant professor of history and interdisciplinary studies at Norfolk State University, trained in both the social sciences and humanities. She is a George Bolenbeck and Virginia Humanities Fellow. She recently obtained the internationally competitive Early Career Award from the John Templeton Foundation for her ongoing project, Minority Millennials and the Rise of Religious Nuns, a conservative analysis. Would you then welcome me in welcoming our two participants today? And we'll start with Matthew Loveland.
Slide ahead. Can you hear me? I'm not usually behind a mic. I'm glad that I'm taller than the podium. That's always a good start. I'm here today to talk about Catholic millennials, and I think I'm going to fit very nicely into the flow here today. The first two talks were both excellent, and there's a number of themes that I'm going to touch on here as I move forward with my talk. But first, I want to say thanks, of course, to Claremont Graduate University and to the Howard W. Hunter Foundation for hosting this event. I want to thank Deja and Ken and Caroline for all the work you did. I interacted with you all, and it was very smooth. And like Pat said earlier, I know that this is a lot of work, so thank you very much for all of that. To all the panelists and speakers, and particularly to the audience, I did not expect to see such a large crowd on a Saturday morning, so thank you so much for being here to listen to us. In particular, I want to say thanks to Patrick. Many of you probably don't know that Patrick and I were roommates in graduate school. That was 20 years ago. It's a little hard to believe it was 20 years ago. But back there in O'Hara Grace number 9, he and I used to have long conversations about religion. I was then, and I still am, a fairly disaffected Catholic. Pat was then a very knowledgeable and wise friend, continues to be so, even more so. He's doing wonderful things. So I really want to say thank you, Patrick, for having me out here to do this. To Dr. Jana Reese, what a wonderful book. I really enjoyed reading your new book. So much data presented so clearly. It's a very hard thing to do. As someone who works with quantitative data, I know it's very difficult to make it readable, and you did that really fantastically. So now I'm going to bore you with data for about 15 minutes, and let's see what we can learn about Catholic millennials. What are some of the guiding themes of the talk that I'm going to give you today? Well, to begin with, I read Dr. Reese's book, and I said, well, how can I respond to that book looking at data on American Catholics? And so the guiding themes here are going to be that generations do in fact matter. The social science of Catholicism has made that claim for a long time. William D'Antonio and his colleagues have been writing about generational change in the Catholic Church for about 30 years. The generations that they focus on, that they say a big shift happened in the American Catholic Church, is pre and post Vatican II. But of course, today there's a lot of conversation about millennials. As a representative of Generation X, I feel like we get a little bit ignored sometimes. I am going to talk today about Generation X as well, as we make these comparisons between the older generations of American Catholics and the rising generations of American Catholics. Just a few months ago, Pope Francis told young Catholics that they are not the future of the church, that they are the present of the church. And so I also want to recognize that while we are here today to talk about millennials, there's a rising generation, Generation Next, I'm calling them for lack of a better term. And I want to think about how we might apply what we can learn about millennials to this rising generation as we move forward. Another theme of my talk is going to be demographic change. I'm going to focus particularly on political change and also the role of ethnicity in transforming the American Catholic Church. Today, we see an American Catholic Church that is largely Hispanic, and that is making a significant impact on the shape of the church, the parish life of the church, the future of the church. I'm going to use some fairly traditional sociology of religion themes of belonging, behaving, and believing, and these are very strongly throughout Dr. Reese's book as well. And I really want to come at the end and ask whether or not this narrative of decline is the right narrative. Certainly in the opening talks, there's been this narrative of decline, and I had this in the back of my mind as I analyzed these data. Do the data support that narrative, yes or no? And so those are the guiding themes of the talk. Now what I'm going to do is show you a bunch of tables. I'm going to try to go to them relatively quickly and highlight the stuff that jumped out to me as I looked through these data. What are the current demographics of American Catholics? For this talk, I'm going to be using data from the General Social Survey. It's a nationally representative survey of American adults. I'm using 6 surveys across 10 years, all right? And that gives me a pretty good sample size. I have about 13,000 respondents. I have about 3,000 Catholics, all right? And the data that I will present will be talking about are about the Catholics across those 6 surveys. So the average age of American Catholics across this sample is 46. So the average Catholic is in Generation X. The 2 largest generations right now in the church are Generation X and the Boomers. Millennials are the 3rd largest generation currently in the church, and so that's where we'll start from. The church is about 58% white, but look at this number Hispanic, 34% Hispanic. That's a significant change that's happened in about the last 40 to 50 years in the church, and we'll explore that change as we move forward. The average income for an American Catholic is about $55,000, and then that political distinction. A lot of people tend to think of Catholics as pretty solid Democrats. There's a story about Catholics being Democrats. That's really a very questionable story, whether or not that's true. In some elections that has been true, in other elections that really hasn't held. We see here that in these data that I'll be looking at today, about half of them identify as Democrat, about a quarter identify as Republican, but we'll see some significant differences in that political identity across the generations as we move forward. How do these demographics differ across the generations that we'll be exploring? So the generations that I will be looking at here are the silent and greatest generation merged into one, the Boomers, Generation X, and Millennials. What I've done with this table, I'll give you a minute to look at it. I won't talk so much, so you can look at the numbers and see what might jump out at you. But what I've done is to highlight the numbers that really popped out to me as I looked at them. Right now, as I said a little bit ago, the 2 largest generations represented in these data are the Boomers and Generation X, though the Millennials certainly are closer and they will be catching up. The Millennials range in age in these data from 20 to 38, all right? And so some of them are really just starting off their adult lives. Others are getting a little bit more established, and that's something to think about. The big shift here that you'll notice is you look at the difference in ethnicity. Those who identify as white versus those who identify as Hispanic. In the early generation of, earlier generations, 7 of 10 are white. In the later generations, we see that 4 out of 10, 5 of 10 are identifying as Hispanic. That's a fairly significant change in the Catholic Church. We'll also then jump down to the bottom, and we can look at the political affiliation. And what we notice among millennials, since that's the generation we'll talk about today, is a decline of Republican affiliation, but not a growth of Democrat affiliation. What we see is a growth of political independence among millennial Catholics. That may in fact be an interesting dynamic to explore as we go forward. In the General Social Survey, we have a fairly good battery of questions about religious practice, religious belief. And so I took what I could from the General Social Survey to identify how Catholics belong to their churches, to the degree that they listen to the authority in their church, and their particular beliefs. We can see here the story of decline. In my take here is that this is a fairly clear trend from stronger belief, stronger adherence to the rules, to weaker belief, weaker adherence to the rules. As you look at this, moving from the silent and greatest generation on the left over to the millennials on the right, you see a decline in the strength of affiliation. Only 23% of Catholic millennials say that they feel strongly affiliated with the Catholic Church. 2 in 10. That's not very many. 7 in 10 say that their affiliation with the church is not strong. 7 in 10. These data came out very clearly there in the previous presentation from the Pew data. As someone who occasionally is asked to talk to church leaders and say, what's the future look like? Those data would suggest that the future doesn't look that good for the institutional Catholic Church. These data from the General Social Survey confirm that concern from the point of view of the leaders. Look at this question about confidence in the church. Generation X actually reports the lowest confidence in the church. Only 1 in 5 members of Generation X say they are confident in the clergy in the United States. But even among the most committed generation, just about 1/3 say that they are confident in the church. So across the generations, not much confidence in the Catholic Church. Attendance, of course, the decline that we see in many different data sets. Almost weekly attendance among millennials, 17%. All right, so very, very low. The interesting question here about the infallibility of the Pope when speaking about moral issues, 2/3 of the silent and greatest generation say yes, the Pope is infallible when speaking about morality. The millennials, I was actually quite surprised at how high it was, almost 50%. That was a surprising number, all right? Still significantly lower than older generations, but given some of the other changes, you might expect it to be even lower than that. I want to jump down to belief in the afterlife, because this resonates with some of the data we looked at a few minutes ago about belief in heaven and hell. Even though we see a story of decline in religious practice, in listening to religious authority figures across the generations of Catholics, belief in the afterlife is actually statistically highest among the millennials. And I looked at that 4 or 5 times before I put it in this chart because I didn't believe it, all right? I simply didn't believe it. 85% of the Catholic millennials across these 10 years of General Social Survey data say that they believe in the afterlife. And this is despite declining rates of attendance, despite declining practice, despite not feeling particularly strong in their affiliation with the Catholic Church. They do seem to have this belief in the afterlife. It's very, very common, 85%. That's a surprisingly high number. Of course, it is high across all of the generations. So that's how belonging, behaving, and believing breaks down across the generations. If we break this down according to generation and ethnicity, because I do see that as one of the big shifts in the Catholic Church, a growing representation of Hispanics in the millennial generation, and that's what I've done here. So what we're looking at here are simply millennials versus everyone else, and then within those two groups, breaking down Hispanic versus non-Hispanic. And you can see that these numbers more or less reflect the trend of the millennials being less religious, less committed than the older generations. But there are a couple of numbers that jump out here, particularly if you are someone who's concerned about the future of the institutional church. Look at this number here, the millennial feeling of affiliation among Hispanic millennials. Only 1 in 5 Hispanic millennials say that they feel a strong affiliation with the church. And this is a very quickly growing segment of Catholics. It is the lowest reported strength of affiliation among any group. So to me, that's a very striking number. 7 in 10 millennial Hispanics say that they do not feel very strong in their affiliation with the Catholic Church. If I'm someone who's concerned about the future of the Catholic Church, that's a number I pay a lot of attention to right there. Again, we can go down and look at the belief in the afterlife, and we see that across the board, those numbers are very strong. 81% among millennial Hispanics, 88% among non-Hispanic millennials. 9 in 10 non-Hispanic millennials believe in the afterlife. What if we now look at some of the moral and political issues of the day? Again, I'm using Dr. Reese's book here as a guideline. Great chapters at the end of that book about how these kinds of issues actually drive some of the wedges between people who stay in the church and those who leave. So these are some questions that really speak to that dynamic. What I've done here is taken from the GSS the questions that might speak to Catholic social teaching in particular. And so we have questions here about sexual behavior, we have questions about abortion, questions about the death penalty. The church has been very public in its political stance in opposition to the death penalty, so it's interesting to see if lay Catholics conform with that teaching or not. And also a recent question on the General Social Survey about whether or not inequality should be reduced in America. So for that question there about less inequality, I only have data from 2018. Strength there being, of course, that it is quite current. So what do we see? I think we see, unsurprisingly, that millennials are much less likely than older folks to think that teen sex and premarital sex are always wrong. They're a lot closer to being teens themselves. They probably are, many of them, still unmarried, and they enjoy sex. We do see a theme here that really correlates strongly with Jana's book, this idea of whether or not extramarital sex is always wrong. Jana's data showed that opposition or thinking that extramarital sex was wrong was very strong across the generations. And that same pattern shows up in these data. No significant difference across the generations, with 83% of millennials believing that extramarital sex is wrong. An unsurprising change there in terms of attitudes about homosexual sex and whether or not that's always wrong. Among the older generation, 6 in 10 say that homosexual sex is always wrong. Among millennials, only 1 in 5. Opposition to abortion, constant across the generations, no real significant differences there. The older generation is more likely to believe that, but 6 in 10 millennial Catholics do oppose abortion. The church's teachings about the death penalty and opposition to the death penalty don't look to be very popular among Catholics regardless of generation, even among millennials, who we'll see tend to be the more progressive, more liberal politically. Only 4 in 10 oppose the death penalty. Two numbers here that really struck out to me at the end have to do with that question about inequality. Generation X Catholics, and I use this measure as a measure of sort of the Catholic social justice teaching, eradicating poverty, that kind of thing. That looks to be really taking off among Generation X, more than 5 in 10 thinking that less inequality would be good for society. Only 1 in 3 millennials think that less inequality would be a good thing. I found that to be a very surprising finding, particularly given some of the political debates going on in the United States these days. But ideologically, millennials are more liberal. I'm measuring political ideology here on a 7-point scale that lower numbers are more conservative, lower numbers are more liberal, higher numbers are more conservative. And we do see here that millennials score significantly lower on that scale, meaning they do, ideologically, they are a bit more to the left than older generations. What if we break this down by Hispanic and non-Hispanic? What do we find? Again, I would pay attention to the ideology here. The millennials do look to be more politically liberal. I was a little bit, I guess I was unsurprised that Hispanic Catholics are more likely to say that inequality should be reduced, often the brunt of institutionalized racism. They would have a political interest in reducing inequality. Other than that, there wasn't a lot of difference across the generations and within the ethnic groups here. Some things might jump out a little bit, but most of these differences were not statistically significant. Though there are some interesting trends in there to think about. I'm going to move so I can finish up. Well, what about this rise of the nuns? What about Michael Hout's recent article about St. Peter's leaky boat? Is the Catholic Church losing its believers? These data would suggest that it is a serious concern, all right? For about 50 years, about 25% of the US population has identified as Catholic, but about a third of the US population was raised Catholic. And so Catholics have been losing a steady number of affiliates for a long time. That trend was stable, but it looks to be increasing. What I want to do here is go to the retention rates, particularly for the white and Hispanic millennials. Retention is lower for the millennials than it is for any previous group. The retention for Hispanic millennials is higher, but it's still just 7 in 10. There are a lot of young Hispanics who are leaving the church. 3 in 10 look to be leaving. Where are they going? That's always the very interesting question. Where are they going? And for generations, there have been 2 destinations for Catholics who leave the church. They tend to adopt no affiliation, so they leave the church entirely, or they become evangelical Protestants. And what we are seeing here is that really now most of that movement is going towards the nuns, all right? Even among Hispanic millennials, 20% have switched to nun. 25% of white millennials have switched to no religious affiliation over the last 10 years. That's a big, big change. So what's it all mean? And this slide I can go through very quickly. I'm curious to hear what you may think it means. Clearly, generations matter. I do think in the Catholic data, we see this shift happening with Generation X, and a lot of what's going on with millennials is really a continuation of that. It does look mostly like decline, but I would say that it's mostly a decline of institutional church commitment and participation. There is still a fair bit of religious belief, particularly in teachings, particularly in beliefs about the afterlife, belief in God, these kinds of things. There is a growth of individualized faith, and I didn't show you these numbers. I only just discovered it this morning. Half of millennial non-theists, and non-theists I define as people who don't believe in a personal God. So they either say there is no God, we can't know, or I believe in a higher power. Half of millennial non-theists believe in life after death. So they do believe in something spiritual, something supernatural. They believe in life after death. So I think maybe what we're seeing here, as Michael Hout has suggested, is a growth of this individualized faith rather than a real loss of religion, though certainly a growth of secularism. Generation Next is now, so I just want us to think about this younger group of Catholics who I'm teaching on a regular basis. Every semester they get younger.
Know the feeling.
And I just simply want to point out to finish up here that right now the church is mostly Generation X and baby boomers. And if they are concerned about the decline of Catholic adherence among millennials, they may have to step up and help to bail out that leaky boat. So thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you again for hosting me. I am pleased to say that no one at any point called me by my full name in the process of this. So I'd like to talk about my research, my ongoing research, which is not only being conducted in the United States, I also am conducting it in Germany as well, and looking at minority millennials. So not only from a national context, but also transnational context. For the purposes of today's presentation, I'll focus more on American minority millennials. And so my major research questions stem from myself being a minority millennial, and the question about how they perceive, interpret, and construct unbelief. As our esteemed scholars have already pointed out, it's a slippery subject, and it's a difficult aspect to quantify. And so I'm interested in how millennials themselves perceive, interpret, and construct unbelief, and how it might influence their civic engagement and political outcomes. And so that great question that Dr. Loveland posed is, if they're not in church, where are they? Where are they going, and what matters to them? What are their aspects of their daily lives that impact them most? And then finally, I hope to, or I'm in the process of, it's a start, and I'd like to expand it on a more multicultural level about how different communities of color experience unbelief. And for me, it comes from an abiding understanding that when we think about millennials, and we think about millennials of color, the overwhelming majority of them come from religious homes, they have aunties and uncles, grandparents who are highly religious. And so they come from that background of being religiously socialized across religion, across race. And so when they do leave, what is the cost for them? The cultural cost of unbelief, for instance, a paper that I'm currently drafting, the cultural cost of unbelief, and thinking about these themes more broadly. And so there's already plenty of data about millennials that has been shared this morning, so I'll just gloss over this and then we'll get to my qualitative research. And so we think about millennials as the nation's largest living generation, and this notion of religious nuns, and these are people who report that they do not belong to a religious community. And when we think about it in respect to minorities and how it may impact different cultural communities, African Americans tend to be extremely religious historically and among the highest religiously involved minority groups. And so even among them, about slightly more than 1 in 10 African millennials report that they're not affiliated with any particular religion. 18% of Hispanic adults aren't affiliated, and about slightly over 1/4 of American Asians are unaffiliated. And so we're finding this growing trend of unbelief, broadly speaking, across different cultures and across different racial and ethnic communities. And so when we think about millennials overall, 1 in 3 state that they are religious nuns. And so for me, the broader question that I have that fascinates me is the question about, will religion decline with the passage of time, or that's called broadly the secularization thesis, and the notion of religion versus spirituality. Will we become a less religious community or society as a whole, or will we become less? And I also loved reading Dr. Reese's work and thinking about, just broadly speaking, the fact that there's little research done on the characteristics of non-white Mormons. That's definitely a research project I'd like to pursue at some point. And so just thinking about what that might mean to young people of color. And so I'd like to go ahead, for the sake of time, and show 2 short videos. And then these videos are derived from my ongoing qualitative analysis in the United States and also in Germany. And based on these videos and over 65 qualitative in-depth interviews, not only in the US and Germany, just giving you a snapshot of what's happening, and then I'll share in my own words about some of the themes that I see emerging across the groups. So hopefully the volume will work. Start off with this. Yes. So we have a young Filipino-American millennial. She'll share her perspective.
In the 21st century,
I think that when you say that millennials are more irreligious, or they're not, like, they don't believe in God, I think that's wrong. I think they've turned away from organized religion because they see how the power structure corrupts. And if we don't do things to fix that, if we don't radically look at the ways in which we've hurt people, and the ways in which history has oppressed other people, then how are we going to change these things? People aren't less moral because they don't look away, they don't turn to church. In fact, I think people are becoming more moral because they have more information available to them. And so I think that if we were to conjoin, like, millennials and religion, if that's your goal, then perhaps you should start looking at the ways tradition is no longer working.
okay. I said one question, that was the last one, but there was one more, because from when you were talking about, you talked about how religion has been oppressing people. Can you talk more about that?
Well, historically, we're taught that the Catholic Church has been used to justify, like, if you look about, like, in South America, like the Athens, like genocide, like American Indians even, like we've used Christian thought as a way to oppress people, to like take the American Indians, like we've like rooted them from their home in like under the idea of like God. Mm-hmm. So, and also like the Philippines even, like we weren't originally a Catholic culture. That was because the Spaniards came and like totally took over our country, colonization as they say, or along those lines. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much.
Yeah, no
Appreciate your
problem.
time.
So I'll go ahead and comment on this video and talk about how, with respect to this video, one major theme that emerges across the interviews is this notion about cultural incompatibility and unbelief. And so a lot of my interviewees report that, for instance, colonialism plays a major role in figuring out whether or not these millennials fit into the social structure of church and recognizing those uncomfortable histories, or the legacy of slavery and how that impacts race and religiosity. And so I found that across the interviews that we have this notion about social structures and how cultural incompatibility might be a concern among millennials about how do they fit in to a social structure that they might not recognize as a trusted authority from the painful history that they are discovering in their own lives or trying to reconcile with their forming identities. With respect to colonialism and the legacy of slavery, let's hear another video and I'll share more about that theme.
Being both an African American and identifying as an atheist in the 21st century has been rather enlightening. I have always sort of had a disconnect with Christianity. My family grew up Lutheran. I did attend a Lutheran church when I was younger, but we were more so like many Americans who are sort of culturally Christian. We weren't religiously so. So that meant I didn't often participate in church. I didn't have any memories of going to Bible study or really taking communion like some of my peers did. And I never really thought much of that or what it meant to be an atheist until I came to university. Now, I'm actually a native of Baltimore, Maryland, but when I came to university, I came down to Norfolk State University in Norfolk, Virginia. And being in the South, I dealt with a lot of people who were not familiar with atheism, especially in African Americans. And it was just very much a disconnect for me to realize that many of my African American peers were very religiously connected and spiritually connected to the traditional African American churches in the area. And for them, there was no life without God. And for a lot of them, they honestly believed that African American identity was tethered to Christianity. And for myself, I never really quite felt that way. I still believe that it's possible to exist as an African American and not be religious in any way, be it Christian or Jewish or Muslim. But I have experienced that many people don't understand that why would I be atheist, especially being Black, and they do, whether they are aware of it or not, they do unexpectedly put certain constraints on me. They expect me to feel a certain way because they expect me to be a Christian. And so that has just been something I've had to work through in my life to kind of make it more clear about who I am as a person and be confident in who I am and not worry about being placed in a box that other people want to confine me in and put labels on me.
So it doesn't share it in this interview, and what I wanted to share, the reason why I wanted to share this interview is that among minority millennials, African American millennials still tend to be the most religious across the different minority millennial groups. However, even among them, there's a growing level of skepticism in leaving the church. And in this case, upon further interviews, I found that this particular millennial shared that sexuality played a role. And so this person identifies as LGBTQ, as trans. And so that notion of incompatibility with the church, of where sexuality fits in, I mean, that's a major component for a lot of millennials, as Dr. Loveland states. And so how does that fit into their identity and then fitting into the social structure of the church? And so while this perceptive young millennial realizes the still very valuable importance of religion and religiosity among African American community, this person had to really figure out where he fit into the church and realized he didn't and left. And so this is another example of a millennial, like the overwhelming majority of my interviewees, who grew up in religious homes. Their grandmothers took them to church, and somehow they found themselves struggling with the social structure of the church due to not just only the historical aspect of colonialism, for instance, or perhaps the criticisms of the legacy of slavery, but then also their sexuality. And so it's a very, as you all know, it's a very complicated conversation, and I'm hoping to delve further into this. And so perhaps, if possible, we can try to show, we have time, right? So we could see if this third video played, or if the audio works, because we'll have another example. If not, then I'll summarize it in my own words. Let's just test it out. Do we have it pulled up, or do we close it? Okay. And then I'll just go ahead and, do you want to go ahead and open it? And so while Deja attempts to pull up this last link, I'll go ahead and introduce it, and it's if you can, if not, I'll go ahead and summarize it in my own words, whether or not it's shown. And so I keep talking about the legacy of slavery, and what does that mean? Again, it's not something I think, it's something that just emerged across the interviews. And what I'm finding here is, as someone who teaches at one of the largest and the oldest historically Black colleges or universities, and looking at African American millennials, they are what they call woke. So that's their terms. And have any of you heard that term, woke? Okay, yeah, and so being woke means also understanding the history of oppression that cuts across different social structures. So not only in the justice system, also within religious community and that history. And so that very recognition of that painful history and that ambivalence. So it's not this straightforward, oh, I know this history of slavery and the legacy of it, but also realizing that, well, but my family, my grandma knows and believes in God, and it's an important historical part of African American community. Civil rights movement, right, was was largely contributed to Dr. Martin Luther King within the church setting. And so there is clearly among millennials an ambivalence about to what extent they belong, will they continue to, because they recognize that painful history. They also know, though, that it has been a source of liberation. So it's not this kind of clear and easy cut negotiation that they're making. And so we can see if I don't know if the audio works.
Why are you not attending church?
I don't feel safe in church. I don't think my spirituality is safe in church. My Blackness, my colorful personality, my colorful spirit, my colorful demeanor, the way I interpret the world, it just doesn't feel safe in church.
Wow. Can you explain more about you being Black and how you feel like that doesn't fit into the church? Because you mentioned that just now.
Yeah, I think Blackness comes in all different forms, and I think Blackness is ambiguous and definitive, and I think the church has a way of marginalizing what it means to be Black, what it means to be respectable, what it means to be accepted, and it's like the church kind of chews out people who don't fit the margin. So it's like you can go, but you're constantly in the back of your mind like, I don't belong here. So it's like it doesn't feel like you can be completely Black and completely free in church.
Okay, I'll stop there so that I can summarize the last theme about related to this video and what I've been sharing with you overall is that for a lot of minority millennials, it's not necessarily and only just because of the hypocrisy of the church per se, because that's a large theme that we see and often discussed in the research literature. It's also about what I've shared with you about that cultural incompatibility, the legacy of slavery, colonialism, and then the third theme about how I was sharing with you about that ambivalence is that cultural cost of unbelief or negotiating family. And so while a number of millennials will say they do not attend church, They will not come out and say they are atheists, that they don't care. And in fact, they'll play both sides of the coin. That when their parents are around, they're going to church. And they're praying, and they're with them. And when their parents aren't, they're not. And they don't see any issue with that. They just see that as a way of preserving their family, their cultural, their community, from avoiding any difficulties with tension. And so I found this within my own ethnic community, Filipino millennials, who I've seen do that a lot, where if their family's around, then yes, they are in the Catholic pews. And they will attend the services because they know that it's an important part of their cultural community. And the cultural expression of being Filipino is there. And so we're not finished with the millennials yet with religiosity. I think that it's an ongoing struggle. And I hope that my talk and these videos shed light on a nuanced analysis of that struggle. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions, so please.
Right, right. Yeah.
It seems like there is a difference between being able to reconcile the difference, or I guess the lack of authenticity,
Mm-hmm.
feel in church.
Right, which would be the opposite of being woke, right? Being inauthentic.
Right, and so, but they're still able to exist within their families, even though that is not necessarily authentic.
Right.
It's performative. Or
Absolutely.
And so, why don't you think, is it that they're exhausted from having to do that in their families, and so they don't want to also do that in church or something like that? It seems like it's a behavior they're capable of, but
Right.
why in family but not in like a religious setting?
Well, I'll speculate. Like, I'm still in the process of analyzing the in-depth interview, and I'm still conducting more interviews. And so, let me say this in response, is that their identities are forming, and they're trying to figure out where they can most express themselves. And so what I found is that for a lot of minority millennials who don't feel like they belong in the church, they will have a social justice issue that they would like to confront or head on. And so they'll be able to find their empowerment outside of the church. And so for me, I'm tracking that aspect of, whereas in previous generations, we think about African American church, empowerment, political empowerment. Then we think about, fast forward to the Black Lives Matter movement, which is a clearly diffuse movement, and it's not centered within and from the church. And so they're much more open to finding other avenues of meaning making within their life, and in that process also being open to different approaches to that.
Please.
I have an observation, maybe it's a question.
Sure.
It comes from mass data, but I suspect both of you might have some
Okay.
observation on it. So we saw that among Hispanic Catholics, millennial Hispanic,
Okay.
there was a fairly low level of commitment to Catholic beliefs as compared to the non-Hispanic Anglo millennial Catholics. I'm wondering if the difference there is among the Anglo white Catholics. You don't believe this stuff, you're not going to tell a pollster you're Catholic. But if you're Hispanic, it's a little different because the connection between your ethnicity and Catholicism is a lot stronger. So saying you're not Catholic might, in your mind, mean, well, then I'm not Mexican American or I'm not Guatemalan American or whatever the particular nationality might be. And I'm wondering, first of all, to hear one reaction, whether that sort of dynamic also plays out in the qualitative interviews that you've done, where you might expect the same basic thing happening with African Americans and the importance of the black church within the black community.
Okay, first. It's a great question and comment. I wrote down a similar comment myself while April was speaking. And I would say that that dynamic of staying Catholic because of the ethnic tie or the tie to the family used to also function for white Catholics. That is a relatively recent change in American Catholicism, being freer to identify as non-Catholic, feeling more capable of doing that, even among white Catholics. I think that you were right to identify that that dynamic is still holding up among Hispanic Catholics for a variety of reasons. But if the data on white Catholics can be projected forward, I would imagine this would change in the future. Again, why I'm very interested in this next generation coming up to see if that dynamic continues or being non-religious among Hispanics becomes more socially acceptable. But I think it's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic question, and I think that's something that I'm trying to tease out in my qualitative data. And as you aptly made that connection with Maya Taylor's video interview about the blowback that he had received from other African Americans, like the broader African American community, from disaffiliating. And so there's definitely that common theme coming out from my interview analysis to date about, well, if they leave, then are they still authentically Black? And so in my current draft right now, I have an article draft that I've just completed called The Cultural Cost of Unbelief. I discuss that aspect of negotiating identity and how culture may play a role and how leaving the church may also mean a sacrifice of one's culture, and that some millennials are grappling with that and decide to ultimately leave because maybe it's not their race that plays the most important role, it's their sexuality in the case of Maya Taylor.
Patrick, please.
So Matt, can the data tell us to what degree the sex abuse crisis was decisive versus, I mean, you've got a lot of headlines, but what we've seen, it's hard to know, it's hypothetical, but to what degree is it decisive versus just one more thing in an overall trend?
So it's sort of the million-dollar question among people who studied Catholics, younger Catholics, and disaffiliation. I'll go with Michael Hout's answer here, which is to say that it's very difficult to argue that it's definitive because a lot of these trends really predate becoming the political scandal that it has become. So I think it's closer to sort of last nail in the coffin kind of explanation. I was already shaky with this church and now this. And I think that, so rather than it being really a driving factor, it really came there at the end of a process that had already begun.
We have time for one more question. Please.
I'm kind of second between the last presentation and what I'm hearing here, because in one of the few presentations, there was a high regard for community building. Now, you're talking about April, you're talking about disaffiliation, which is culture bound. My question is, after they are becoming disaffiliated with their culture and their community, African Americans or Islamics or Hispanics,
Or Hispanics.
are you really looking at what happens next, where they go from the community, where they find their home?
So I get into that very briefly. Yeah, I have written about community building among non-believers, particularly younger non-believers, and you are seeing a growing movement of sort of intentionally secular community organizing itself around regular meetings, be they at coffee houses or in people's homes or via Meetup app on their phone. So you can get on Meetup and you can find meetings of plenty of secularists and atheists, and you go meet them at the bar or wherever. And so there definitely is a growing movement towards intentional community among non-believers. So I would refer to that intentional community. That's definitely. So when they leave the church, they don't just disappear. They don't go nowhere, right? They still have friends. They still build community.
Yeah, another excellent question. And so in my in-depth interviews, I also track their non-religious civic engagement because I want to know what they're up to. What are they doing if they're not in church? Where are they going? And so I've noticed that across my interviews, the notion about community building is bundled in with notions of empowerment. And so for millennials, that's a very important, it appears to be a very important value of empowerment. And so we're finding, and so my data is largely drawn from college campuses, so it's limited in that sense. And what we're finding, though, is they do care about community. They care about empowerment and solidarity. And what they do is they join the organizations that speak to those specific issues, whether it's something related to LGBTQ issues, whether it's environmentalism or social justice issues about race and immigration, for instance. And what they'll also do is not only will they join within their own racial and ethnic group, but then have a pan-ethnic collaboration on those social justice issues that are not necessarily or directly tied to the church per se.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you, April. That wraps up our comparative perspectives panel. We'll take a 10-minute break and convene at 11:40. Can we give them a round of applause, please?